Thank you. And thank you to Rick and Anna for your presentation. I think you did a really great job of capturing the kind of chaos and the workload associated with it. I was fortunate enough to be close enough to see what was going on and think about it, but didn't actually have to participate directly in the remediation efforts. And so tonight, for y'all, I want to talk about a couple of things that I think will be, now that we're through the initial remediation for these Log4j vulnerabilities, I want to talk about what I think will be some of the medium and longer term impacts of this. By way of background, I'm a software developer by background. I've been involved with OWASP for a long time. I was one of the original members of the Global Membership Committee a long time ago, helped run the San Antonio chapter for a long time. We need to have a meeting, I think, to get the chapter turned back on. Work-wise, I was one of the founders of and the CTO at Denim Group, and with the acquisition of Denim Group in June of last year, now I'm the Vice President of Product Strategy at Coalfire. So from an agenda standpoint, I want to talk a little bit about the Log4j background, but honestly, the other talks tonight, I think, probably provide better insights. What I'm going to look more at is how do I think that these Log4j vulnerabilities are going to impact organizations that are producing software as well as organizations that are consuming software. And I think that's actually really interesting. Looking at both sides of that coin, because honestly, for all the talk we've had in the application security space about how it's important to do security early and why it's really valuable, it's the right thing to do, a lot of those arguments are good hygiene arguments. And it's not that they're invalid, but they haven't on their own been successful in changing the behaviors within industry. But where I have seen behavior changes are situations where software consumers, the people with money, go to their vendors and say, security is now something that you have to do, otherwise we will hold up, we won't buy your software, or we won't go through this upgrade. And they're using essentially the power of the money as consumers to shape the behavior of their vendors. And if you spread that across the entire industry, then all of a sudden everyone has to get better. And so that's, again, one of the biggest changes that I've seen versus a lot of the early talk about, let's build security in and it's the right thing to do. Again, all valid arguments. We want to look at what changes behavior. It is pain. And I think what we, certainly something to get from the previous talk was the pain that these Log4j vulnerabilities and their remediation cause to organizations. And so I want to look at the behavior changes that I think will come out of that. And along the way, I also want to highlight a number of what I think to be really valuable resources that OWASP provides that can help software producers and software consumers in dealing with what I see as being these upcoming trends. And so we're specifically going to look at software bills of materials, the choices of whether to upgrade or remove components, as well as vendor management and the questionnaires that are associated with those. And again, please submit questions via the YouTube. Happy to answer anywhere I can. So this was the beginning in my organization. This is the beginning. I get up early, work out, feed the dogs, get cleaned up, sit down at my workstation, and I was looking through Twitter and noticed this blog post about the Log4Shell vulnerability, and notified the team. I was like, hey gang, I expect that we're going to get a couple questions about this, so be prepared. And as you see, one of my colleagues replied, hey, that would explain some of the InfoSec memes I've seen this morning on Twitter. And I also have to compliment Rick and Anna. They had an excellent collection of Log4Shell or Log4j memes. And so this really kicked off the saga in our organization. We're both a producer of software, a consumer of software, and act as application security consultants. This was kind of the beginning of all of it, and I can see at least a short way into the future. And I said, hey, y'all, we are going to have to spend. This is going to consume some of our time, in the coming days. As it turns out, I was right. Again, for background, the other presentations from today are probably much better at looking at some of the technical details, some of the and some of the short-term impact. I'd also recommend people look at Matt Conda, who is I believe a former at this point now OWASP board member, longtime board contributor. He has put up a really valuable blog post with link to some slides and some video that talk about the underlying issues with the that the Log4 shell vulnerability identified. So for those technical details, there's other resources that I think are going to be more valuable. What I want to look at again is the short-term impacts. When we look at Owen and what he's going to be talking about, how this ruined Christmas. Somehow this happens every year. There's every year there's some sort of ridiculous breach or vulnerability that ties people up. And again, what we saw was, or what I saw both in our organization as well as in the organizations where we act as an advisor on application security, a lot of scrambling. What applications do we have that are using Log4j? Which of them are potentially exploitable? How do we upgrade these to a non-exploitable version? But that first question begs another broader question, which is, wait a minute, everyone, what do we have an inventory of all the applications that we have just in general? Do we know all of the stuff that we have? Do we understand our attack surface? And so that's kind of a first thing is a lot of organizations didn't have, it was impossible for them to start out in a structured way addressing this because they didn't have a good view of what their organization's attack surface looked like. Again, at Coalfire, we have a managed attack surface, management service that can talk about that elsewhere. But from an OWASP standpoint, a really fantastic resource that OWASP has in starting to help organizations answer that question is the AMAS project. And so that helps to do this attack surface detection and management. What applications do I have? And so it has a number of ways that it goes through and looks at DNS records and URL crawling and things like that, guessing subdomains and a variety of other approaches. But OWASP AMAS is a really, really impressive project. Again, OWASP freely available that can help you as an organization start to get an understanding of what are all the applications that we have hanging off of our attack surface, right? So really, really great resource and recommend people take a look at that. Then once you find applications, asking which are vulnerable. Another OWASP project I'd like to highlight is the OWASP ZAP project. It is a web proxy, great for web app penetration testing, API testing, as well as an automated DAST scanner. Has a great API, very automatable. So just in general, a great security tool, freely available to organizations. And they've got some resources that they've published, looking at how is ZAP related to Log4Shell and how can you use ZAP potentially to detect if applications are vulnerable to Log4Shell. So again, as you try to answer these questions, right now with Log4Shell, but in general, the next time something horrible happens and ruins your Christmas, these are some resources that are available to help you, identify your attack surface, as well as vulnerability to Log4Shell or potentially whatever the next Log4Shell vulnerability is. Now, if we look at what are these, how is this going to play out forward in the industry? And I don't necessarily think that that my suggestions here are anything earth-shattering, because really what they're doing, or what I believe is going to happen, is these are going to they're going to really accelerate some previously emerging trends, and they're going to bring those more to the forefront. And I'll talk about some other pressures in the industry that I see that are, again, pushing these types of things forward. As I mentioned, organizations change behavior, organisms, things change their behavior based on pain and discomfort. And hopefully organizations will take some of the lessons learned from the pain from Log4j and use that to project forward to make the next one of these less painful, right? And so the areas we're going to talk about, again, looking at software bills of materials, choices of whether or not to upgrade or remove components, and vendor management. And this talk is essentially a talk version of a blog post that I have, and there's a link to that out and available on the web. And so, a software bill of materials, right? And I look at this as literally the least we can do as an industry, right? And so, what a software bill of materials is, just like a normal bill of materials, if you have some sort of manufactured product, it's going to say you need 4 wheels of this spec, 4 of these bolts, 8 of these washers, nuts. It's basically the list. What are the components that go up into building this manufactured product? When you translate that to software, it's a question of what are the software components, especially typically focused on open source components. What components have I included in this software, and what versions of those components am I using? Right. So it's a list of, for a given piece of software, this is everything that got pulled in to this build of the software. And I really view being able to articulate what is in the software you have people deploy as like literally the least that we can do. Right. And it's something that we've seen from sophisticated consumers for a number of years, right? Especially in the banking and the financial services sector. Again, the folks that tend to have more mature application security programs, this is something that they've been concerned about for years. And so we get requests, hey, for this release, we need to know all the open source components and their versions. Everybody is willing to typically accept those in a Microsoft Excel sheet. I'm sure that those Excel sheets at this point are subject to tremendous scrutiny. I'm sure people are reading exhaustively through them. And I'll talk again about some ways I think that'll change here going forward. And these are typically pretty easy to generate if you have a software composition analysis tool that you're running, or again, there's utilities for a lot of Maven and other build packages that make it fairly easy to generate these things. Also, another area where that has kind of brought up or brought software bills of materials into the conversation is the Biden administration, the U.S. Biden administration's executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. They also mentioned software bills of materials, and something that I'm certainly paying attention to with great interest is to see if we look at how the U.S. federal government changes the way that they develop software and purchase software, how is that going to flow out to the U.S. private sector, and and how is that then going to flow out into the rest of the world? I think that for almost every software company, the U.S. federal government is a very attractive potential customer, and so I will be really interested to see how this moves the needle in the more broad application security landscape. And when I look at software bills of materials being literally the least we can do, it reminds me of, and I don't know how many of you all, again, in the Netherlands are familiar with Van Halen. I'm not sure how much U.S. culture makes its way over there, probably more than should. But there was a long-lasting story about Van Halen where they had a writer for their concerts, a contract writer for their concerts that said they needed a bowl in the green room. They needed a bowl of M&Ms with all the brown ones removed, right? And I think this was often perceived as being these rock bands doing crazy stuff, right? Just making bizarre requests. But really, what they used that as was a checksum or a shibboleth, right? Because this was a really large touring show. They had a lot of requirements for the weight that floors could support, for doorway sizes and things like that. And if the concert venue and the crew associated with this couldn't be bothered or hadn't looked at the contract writer in sufficient detail to know that they shouldn't have brown M&Ms in the bowl of M&Ms, that's a likely indicator of other problems, right? And so when I look at this, if you go to a software vendor and they either can't or won't produce a software bill of material, that's a canary in the coal mine. That would lead me to ask, well, what else is all screwed up in this organization in the way that they produce software? And so that's something where if you're a software producer, so looking at this from the producer side, expect increasing requests for software bills of materials, right? As I said, we've seen that from the forward-leading sectors for a long time. Expect that to make its way more broadly across the industry. As I said before, I think a lot of organizations get those software bills of materials and file them away in somewhere to be consulted. Never. I would also start to expect increasing scrutiny on the contents of these software bills of materials. And so you're going to want to proactively augment your tooling and your development practices, right? So when the first customer comes and asks for a software bill of material, again, it's one thing, the technical tooling is usually pretty straightforward, assuming you have a reasonably modern tool set. That's pretty straightforward. But what is the process that your organization goes through in order to get that artifact created and blessed? And another thing to think about is from a legal or regulatory standpoint, who do you have to go ask in the organization? Do I have the ability to take this document that probably has information considered to be confidential and to provide that to a consumer? If you have already gone through this process, you're going to look a lot more polished, to your software consumers than if this, when this request comes in, it creates a Log4j like fire drill to go and address these issues, right? So this is something, if you're a producer of software, expect to start producing this and go through what does that entire process look like from producing it for a recent build and actually transmitting it. Understand that, and you're going to look like you have, like you're a lot more squared away. For software consumers, I think you certainly need to start asking for software bills of materials. Right? Again, the more people that do this, the more this is going to become a common practice, and everyone around the industry is going to start adopting this, which I think has a lot of value. But I think you also need to look at what sort of tooling are you deploying in order to manage these bills of materials and monitor their status? And you need to have practices in place to deal with these alerts. It's only the beginning of the process to collect these software bills of materials. What are you actually going to do with them, and how are you going to use them? Or do you just have those stored in a folder somewhere to use, for litigation support later on, right? If you really want to impact your security, you can't just collect them. You've also got to have the infrastructure around them to manage them and to take action. From an OWASP standpoint, there are two projects that are really valuable, and they're related. There's the CycloneDX project, which is a standardized data format. I think there's about 3 of them that are reasonably prominent right now. But CycloneDX seeing really great adoption. And the OWASP Dependency Track project. And this is a platform not to be confused with Dependency Check, which is a software composition analysis tool. So these are related, but Dependency Track is for managing software bills of materials across the application portfolio, tracking new CVEs as they arrive, and alerting when you have software that may now be known to have vulnerable components. These are both projects run by Steve Springett, again, longtime OWASP contributor. They are fantastic. Worked with them. Really, really enjoy these, and great freely available resources that you can use in your organization to get started. So moving on. Another thing that we've seen both in discussions that I've had with customers of ours as well as advisory customers of ours, a challenge with software composition analysis tools is that they have traditionally they flag the presence of vulnerable versions of components, right? And so you have the Apache HTTP utility library XYZ that's known to have a denial of service vulnerability. That's great to know that you've pulled that component in, but that level of analysis flags a lot of potential non-issues. And it can be very disruptive if you've got to, for every result that comes out of this tool, look and determine, well, hey, do we think that this is actually an issue? Why do we think it is or it isn't? Like, that type of analysis is very time consuming, right? So what we've seen the software composition analysis tool vendors have done, they've started to augment these tools with data and control flow analysis so they can characterize the usage of vulnerable components. And this is great because it can show you, hey, you're pulling in this vulnerable component, but you're not actually ever touching any methods that are associated with this vulnerability. You're using different parts of that component. That's fantastic. Something that we've seen, which is frustrating, is I've had conversations where software consumers don't care, right? They've, we've gone and said, hey, we're using, this version of the component. It's got known vulnerabilities. We've done our risk assessment and we don't actually use the vulnerable parts of that component. And the response we get back is, we don't care, right? You either need to upgrade to a known non-vulnerable version or the component needs to not be in there. That is the standard that we have. And, flipping this around, that for a consumer, how much do you really want to trust the analysis that your software producer has done when they have an incentive to say we looked at this and it's not an issue, right? The same thing, any penetration tester who's ever gone and talked to developers, the first reaction in too many cases is that's not the way it works in production, right? Or that's not an issue, right? Again, as a software consumer, I understand that decision just to say, I don't want to do my own risk analysis. I don't necessarily trust your risk analysis. Show me that you're on a non-vulnerable version, or show me that you've removed the component. So for software producers, you need to prepare to come armed with better data on potential exploitability. Trust us is a less compelling argument than maybe it was before. And what I really hope this does for a lot of software producers is cause them to evaluate, how do you handle technical debt from open source components, right? How long do you wait to do upgrades, especially for point releases that shouldn't have any API changes or compatibility issues? This is a really incredible couple of opportunities for automation. Some of the SCA vendors are now providing automated patches via pull requests or things like that. Your CI/CD pipeline, hopefully most organizations, the critical software is running through pipelines to validate builds. This creates an opportunity with some scripting where you can fix things in the background until something breaks, right? So let's just keep upgrading components to the latest version or to known non-vulnerable versions. Feed that build through the CI/CD pipeline and smoke test it, see if it works, right? Wait, just upgrade everything you can until something breaks. That's the point then where developers need to go in and look at the impact analysis of doing upgrades, right? So I think that's a really exciting opportunity for organizations to use this automation, in order to really revolutionize the way that they handle tech debt, away from let's do quarterly, we're going to move things forward, or on a vulnerability report, then we're going to make a determination. Again, I think those, with the way that tooling is going for organizations, I think there's really cool opportunities for automation here. For software consumers, right? What I would recommend is, to be realistic and consistent and clear about what you require and what the standards are that you are expecting to be to. As an aside, but if every organization that buys software is a real jerk about this, that's going to push the industry forward faster, right? And so again, if you as a buyer is causing pain and saying, no, hey, just upgrade this stuff and you need to show me that you have practices that gets this stuff upgraded on a timely manner, if everybody's a jerk about this, then every organization is going to have to behave better. And so that's we'll see how that works going forward. From an OWASP standpoint, some things that you have available to help you out. There's this concept of vulnerability exploitability exchange. And, that's a question of, do these included vulnerable components actually expose the software to exploitation, and being able to express that in a structured way. Cyclone DX has the capability to take these documents and look at software bills of materials and munge those together in order to determine that. So there are ways to, in a structured manner, communicate some of these potential exploitability. Again, if you're a software producer, good luck getting people to trust that. Finally, looking at questionnaires, vendor management questionnaires. And this is, vendor security management has been a thing for a while, and questionnaires are primarily the tool of the trade, right? I think that these are going to get rough, right? And I've seen this myself, all right? I think they're going to have greater scope. There's going to be more topic areas, including looking at application security practices, not just data management practices and other kind of more standard, information security stuff. And they're going to get more invasive and specific with questions, right? I made the mistake of I have a saying with some of my friends that no good deed goes unpunished. Like the world is undefeated in punishing every good deed that you ever do. We had a vendor management questionnaire that was languishing, and I volunteered to help because I had some extra time. Well, the reason it was languishing because it was huge and super in depth, and so I stepped up and said, "Hey, I'll help out with that, guys." And instantly regretted it because it was, like a 4-tab spreadsheet with hundreds of items that really went into very specific detail about the organization's practices, right? And so it was a real bear to go and sort out. So if you're a software producer, you need to build a library of answers that can be reused and repurposed, right? And this is something where it really pays to have a regular cadence of updating and maintaining, on a structured way. Let us know when things change so that when we get new questionnaires, we can go and rely on a lot of things that have already been produced in order to answer those questions, and the information is up to date. I would also just caution everyone, we also have a saying that business lying is fraud, and so you have to be truthful in responding into how you actually enact these various procedures. That's very important, should go without saying. But again, business lying is fraud. For software consumers, the request I have here is to rely on standardization wherever possible, right? Your organization, I'm sure, does wonderful work in the world, but at the end of the day, you're not a special snowflake. You have a risk profile that is going to be similar to other organizations. And if you can standardize, that's going to make the process more efficient all around of getting people to answer questionnaires, to generate answers, as well as for you to evaluate. And I'd also recommend to be very clear on your criteria in your decision-making process. I've seen a lot of questionnaires that have that overreach, or that say all these other measures are required, right? And so I think it's important to be clear on what is actually required for different types of software, and which practices are a nice to do, or what is your risk budget. Because if everything on the questionnaire is the most important and you require an over-the-top answer, if everything's important, then nothing is important, and you're going to get data that is probably not going to be helpful in evaluating risk because it's going to obfuscate what the actual practice is, or you're just going to get outright lies. And so for software consumers, it's tempting to really crank down these questionnaires and make them huge and set a very high bar. I think you need to be realistic in what you're asking for if you want to get data that you can actually use to make decisions. OWASP, again, has 2 great resources here to help. The OWASP Software Assurance Maturity Model, that's a very structured way at looking at how mature are the application security practices for a product team, right? And so, and it's a structured way. You could also look at the BSIM in the same way, but it's looking at, if you're asking an organization about their practices, you can pin to this standard that you can point toward and say, well, hey, we use OWASP SAM. Here's the level of maturity we have in each of these different business practices. Similarly, the OWASP ASVS is the application security verification standard. And so that lets you speak in a structured and standardized way what level of security inspection has been performed on a specific release of software, and what vulnerabilities, or what are the character of vulnerabilities that were identified. Again, much better than using OWASP Top 10 as a standard. That's a risk education document, not a standard. The OWASP ASVS is a standard. So you can say, hey, we've evaluated a software at this level of ASVS, and we found, 1 critical, 2 highs, and 3 mediums. We remediated the criticals and highs, and the mediums are going to be addressed in the next release. Whatever that might be, it lets you speak in a structured way or ask questions in a structured way. And again, what we want to see is, or what I think is best for the industry, is tying back to these sorts of standard documents so that everyone has a common language to talk about this. That's going to make it much easier for organizations to meet these bars. There's some other resources out there. I spoke at the Black Hat CISO forum last year, looking at supply chain security, but through the lens of CI/CD pipelines, and speaking at RSA this year on kind of an evolved version of that perspective. Again, I think I've got a couple minutes left here. I'd love to answer any questions that people have.